It's time for another round of algae research summaries. Today's topic, algae blooms. Hey, I'm Alian, and I'm once again experimenting with microalgae. Every so often, I take a step back from my projects to learn more about the field of algae as a whole. Now at the moment, I'm looking for a new long-term algae project. Yes, I have the bioreactor, and it's been awesome exploring the intersection of biology and software. But I'm not really working on solving a problem. So I want to start another research and potentially new experiment, similar to my wastewater project that I was working on a few months ago. So I'm going to spend this vlog, and some future episodes, exploring different areas of algae research to come up with an interesting problem to tackle. My goal is to find a well-defined problem and an experiment I can run in my basement lab to go with it. And the first thing I want to link into is algae blooms. Algae blooms take me back to when I was first starting these videos, because they're directly related to wastewater treatment. As I'm sure you know if you've watched any of these videos, algae require nutrients to grow, and two of those nutrients are nitrate and phosphate, which I focused on in my wastewater experiment. And actually, part of the reason why I started working on wastewater was because I had learned about algae blooms, and how, because of poor wastewater treatment, excess nitrate and phosphate was ending up in bodies of water like lakes and rivers across Canada and the world. And what I found was that algae blooms were constantly appearing because of those excess nutrients. So I started looking into the root cause of that problem, wastewater treatment, and how we could eliminate that nitrate and phosphate, and that's what led me down the whole rabbit hole of algae. But algae blooms are still very much related to this. Algae blooms are the excessive growth of algae on the surface of a body of water, and you can see an example of one right here. Now, there's a few reasons why we care about algae blooms. And one of the big ones is that they can be really damaging to the ecosystem. When the algae are in full growth bloom form, they can choke out plants and other animals. And when they die, they increase what's called the biological oxygen demand of that body of water, which essentially takes away all the oxygen from any other plants or animals that want to survive in that water. So they kind of have a double effect, both when they're alive and when they're dead, that damages the ecosystem. And on top of that, they can also have some pretty significant economic implications for people that are involved in the fishery industry. Because as algae blooms survive and grow, they can end up choking out fish populations that are vital for these fisheries and for people to eat. So not only is there significant environmental impact, but there's also an economic incentive to reduce algae blooms, which is why I find it super interesting. Right now, we have 3 different ways of eliminating algae blooms: by physical, chemical, and biological methods. So I'm going to go through all 3. Let's start with the simplest method: physically removing the algae from the water. If we can just take the algae out of the water as they're blooming, they won't die and they won't impact the ecosystem. The most common method for this is filtration, where all the water is passed through a very fine filter that catches all the algae while letting the water flow through. This works for large species of algae, but it begins to have problems if the algae get too small, because they start flowing through with the water. Chemical methods are similar to physical methods in that idea, but they go a step further. Like I mentioned, one of the big problems with physically removing algae is that they're really, really tiny, like only visible with a microscope tiny. And that means you can't just scoop them up. So to make this easier, we use a class of chemicals called coagulants or flocculants that cause the algae to clump together. And then they're a lot easier to pick up. And over here you can see an example of algae that aren't flocculated versus ones that are. Now the main issue with this method is that the chemicals can sometimes be costly, and often you require large amounts of chemicals for the flocculation to be effective, especially if the algae bloom is really big. Now lastly, we have biological methods, where we leverage different organisms to control the algae bloom. For example, there exist certain types of seaweed that actually release toxins that are harmful to algae. So, people will plant the seaweed in a lake or a river, and then when an algae bloom happens, the seaweed toxins get triggered, and the algae bloom is naturally controlled. This is super awesome, because it can work in the long term, and doesn't require too much human intervention. The problem arises though when you're introducing potentially invasive seaweeds that imbalance the ecosystem and could cause more problems. So there are the 3 main ways that we can treat algae blooms that I saw in my research. What I'm realizing is that while they're all different, they all have one thing in common. They're all treating the algae like it's a pest, something to get rid of fast and throw away. But as someone that's worked on a lot of awesome applications of algae, I know they're not as bad as algae blooms make them sound, and that they have a lot of potential. Algae blooms are basically a free algae factory that we can harvest from and use. Harvesting even a fraction of this algae could yield the biomass for tons of useful applications, like making cheap biofuel or creating building materials. And that's what I think current methods are missing. A way to make use of the algae once you clean up the algae bloom. I'm not quite sure what method could do that yet, and I'm gonna have to do some more research to figure it out. Which means that if you work with algae blooms or if you're connected to someone who does, please reach out. I'd love to talk to you and see how we can solve this problem together. Now, that's all for this week. Soon I'll have some more updates on this idea and some other areas I want to research. Oh, and one last thing. Next week marks 1 full year of these videos. I know, I can't believe it either. So I'll have a special episode coming out next week. So if you're not subscribed on YouTube or aren't following on LinkedIn yet, make sure to do that to see it right when it comes out. And with that, I will see you in the next one.